Well, I'm Richard Hammond. I'm a professional photographer for the last 60 plus years. My father started the business in 1946. He originally was a bank clerk and then got TB and had to retire through ill health. So he went to a tuberculosis sanatorium on the Cotswolds and recovered from that. And when he came back, he'd always been interested in photography, and he had a little dark room in Castle Street where he was born. So he set up as a photographer, and we lived out then at Brainton. Rented a cottage from some people. He was a soldier in the Second World War, sorry. So Frank Dorr was a builder, and their house, his wife went to live with their relatives in Burg Hill. So we rented their house. It had a big field at the side, and we had a couple of ponies there and a big cottage garden. And father kept bees, and so we were self-sufficient. I had to walk up to the dairy every morning with 2 cans to collect the milk at the age of 7, and then I walked to school at Lower Brainton School, which was by the church there, and I think it was about 2 to 3 miles, but everybody says the older you get, the further you used to have to walk to school. But I reckon there's a good 3 miles, and that, of course, was during wartime. I was born in 1936, so the time we moved to Brainton, I was about 7 years old. I was actually born down in Bournemouth, near Poole, a little place called Lilliput, a suburb of Poole, because father was in the bank there, and he moved to Newport in Shropshire, the bank, and that's when he got TB and had to retire. And I think he had a pension of something like 30 shillings a week after 19 years work, so there wasn't a lot of money there. My mother was a farmer's daughter from Leicestershire, and he'd met her when he was in the bank at Leicester, and he used to lodge in the village and walk to the bank each day, and she used to feed the chickens and made sure that she was there feeding the chickens as he walked by, so that's how they met. But father was a keen sportsman like my grandfather, who played rugby and played for one of the best teams in Leicester, and at one stage he was sent down to the Welsh Valleys, and he was a good drinker and a good rugby player, so he fitted in well with got on well with the Welsh down there. But anyway, that was that. So after the war, he set up Hammond's Photography in my grandmother's shop in King Street, opposite Gardener's, and she had a hairdresser's salon above the shop and a flat above that. And during the wartime, she had a lodger there, or refugee, a Polish refugee, called Madame Brenska, who was Polish and smoked a pipe. And she gave piano lessons. And she wore black bombazine, a bit like Queen Victoria. She always looked a bit like Queen Victoria. But grandmother also, my grandfather died in the 30s. And as you know, they lived in Castle Street to start with. When he died, which was a government house, she moved to those houses in front of the cathedral, along with John Ellis's parents and all that. And then that was demolished. Somebody bought the houses, and gave them to the cathedral to be demolished to get a better view. So she went to King Street. And next door were Russell, Boulder and Bright. So we knew Mr. Russell, Mr. Boulder and Mr. Bright, the original founders. And later in the 60s, father sold that, after my grandmother died, that half to Russell, Boulder and Bright. So they made that double frontage. And we moved up the passageway to the Friends Meeting House, the Quakers Meeting House, and had a huge studio because the upper floor wasn't used. It was a great big barn of a room. And of course, in those days, we didn't have electronic lighting. It was bulbs, great big bulbs about that size of football, mounted across the ceiling. And we then had all our processing equipment up there. And of course, everything was glass plates originally. And then I trained at Gloucester School of Photography, which was part of their College of Art. And I used to we lived at Fownhope in those days, and I used to cycle to Home Lacey to catch the train. And a little steam train came puffing along, and it stopped at everywhere, Forley, all the way Ross, and you got off at Gloucester and walked up through the cattle market, which was in the centre, there was still cattle there, to the college, and then caught the train back. And it was a lovely little commuter service, because if the driver of the train was in the station, he saw you cycling down the slope, he'd wait until you Didn't have to lock your bicycle up or anything, you just dumped it and got on the train. So that was good. Then I went into the Air Force in 1955, and they didn't take you on as a photographer for national service. You had to sign on for 5 years to train. I don't know that. But they said, well, if you sign on for 3 years, you get an extra £10 a month. I thought, crikey, that's good. So I signed on for 3 years, so I became a regular. And I had a wonderful time in the Air Force. Didn't do photography, but I was trained as a typist, and it's been ever so useful because I've been able to type ever since. And I was stationed for a lot of the time down on a flying station in Somerset, where they flew Canberras, and we were issued with bicycles, and we cycled around the airfield every morning, and it was a wonderful time. At the age of 18, to be no worries, no family, no children, no mortgage, and everything supplied, uniform, food, even a bicycle, you know. So that was a great life. Then I came back and, of course, started to work for father. And in those days, we did everything. We were known as general practitioners, GP photographers. Every high street had a photographer. Everywhere in the you know, there were 2 or 3 in Hereford. There's Donovan Wilson. But in those days, every town had a high street photographer, if not 1 or 2, and there were famous people in London, of course, all the great names. But photography had taken off, and nobody in the 50s really could take decent photographs, because the best thing they had was a box camera, and we had big field cameras, took half plate 7x5 glass slides, and they would employ a professional, because for weddings and so on, the best they could manage were little fuzzy snapshots, and we did the real McCoy. And we used to do a wedding for about £25, I think, which was, and after the war you did a 12-shot wedding, which was 1 roll of film you could do, and you could cut it down to doing the bride arriving with her father, the groom and the best man arriving, the bridesmaid arriving. Then if the vicar allowed it, you did a shot inside the church, a time shot. Sometimes they didn't allow photography in the church. And then we usually did a dummy shot of them signing the register. And they came out and you did a bride and groom shot, a bride alone, bride and bridesmaids, bridal group, which is the bride's family, then the groom's family, and then a group with all the family in. And usually the mothers were sat on chairs. And then you used to dash off to the reception and do a dummy cake cutting shot. And you'd say, stand by the cake, hold the knife, put the flowers around it, look at the camera, flash and go. And we would do perhaps 3 or 4 weddings on a Saturday, because the most you'd spend on a wedding was 2 hours. Then now, of course, people start shooting the bride as she gets out of bed in the morning, the bridesmaids getting dressed at about 8 o'clock, and they carry on through the day shooting hundreds and hundreds of pictures, and they end up going to the disco at night, and that finishes at about 2 o'clock in the morning. Well, I mean, you know, something like a 14, 18-hour day to do a wedding with thousands of pictures. You see them on CDs, and they've got pictures of a flower and a glass and odd little things like that. And we used to have to limit ourselves, because film was expensive and it wasn't readily available. We bought a lot of our paper after the war from government dispersal sales. We used to buy rolls of paper that was used in aerial reconnaissance. They used to have rolls of paper, and so you'd use that. But and then gradually, of course, you took more and more pictures. But even so, when I started, we were using a 5x4 camera, which is, you know, that size, sheet film, and you took the groups and everything on that and used the Leica or a Rolleiflex for do the candid shots. And eventually, as film got better and not so grainy, you would go onto a Rolleiflex and you could enlarge that up. But in the old days, small frame negatives, you couldn't enlarge, they looked a bit fuzzy. So it had to be on a big camera. And of course we did weddings, portraits, babies, industrial, commercial. Didn't do aerial, I did 1 or 2, but Donovan Wilson was the expert at aerial photography, so he got most of those jobs. But we photographed factories, people, all sorts of events, and every GP photographer had to do everything. You know, you had to, and of course you developed and processed all your own film. So we had 3-gallon tanks of developer, fixer, and so on. And my first job was putting the glass plates into holders and dipping them in, and you had to agitate them for about 20 minutes at 70 degrees, and then you rinse them, and and it was in total darkness, and then put them in the fixer, and then wash them for about half an hour, and then put them in a great big drying cupboard to dry them. So glass plates eventually gave way to sheet film, and then of course it came to roll film, and then in the 60s we started shooting colour, but you couldn't process colour yourself. It was bloody hell, six bath process, so that used to go off to laboratories, and there were laboratories everywhere. And prior to that, wedding pictures used to be coloured by hand. There was a company called A.H. Leach & Co. of Brighouse in Yorkshire, who employed dozens of hand painters there, and you could have 3 grades of colour. You could have basic colour, which was like a wash, and then you could go to the very expensive one, which was beautifully hand-coloured, tiny lines like miniature artists did in the old days. So you used to send a sample of the, say, what colour flowers, what colour dress, sample of bits of fabric off to these people, and they come back. Now, those hand-coloured pictures are just as good today as they were 50 years ago, whereas colour photographs, as you know, they've gone purple, orange, green, you've lost them altogether. But of course, when we started, we had orthochromatic film, which wasn't sensitive to red light, so you could process in the darkroom with a red light. You see a lot of old films now, Hitchcock, people with a light on in the darkroom. You could use a red light, very dull, and see what you were doing. But then when panchromatic film came in, which was sensitive to all the colours, you couldn't process except in complete darkness. So you had that, and we had 2 or 3 girls printing, had big enlargers, and they printed. One enlarger did 35mm, another one did 2 1/4 square film, and the others did the big sheet film and glass plates. And these were huge things, Aldis and Kodak enlargers. And then it was all printed, and the printer was really a very skilled artist, because they had to shade and dodge the pictures. You had your masking frame, you put the paper in, and then you had little bits of wire with blobs of paper on the end, and you could hold back bits that were too dark and make them lighter, and you could darken. You had another piece of paper with a hole in it. You could move that around and darken patches which were a bit light, and then your paper was developed. You've seen pictures of film. The paper comes up, the image comes up, and then it was washed, and then it was put in a fixer. We had a cascade of tanks, big metal tanks, a whole row of them, and as the water changed, it got, till it was pure, and then it went on to a thing called a Kodak rotary glazer and dryer, and it was a huge heated drum, about 24 inches wide, and it went very slowly round with a cloth belt, and you put your prints on face down if they were matte prints, and it dried them, and if they were glossy prints, you put them face up. You used glossy paper, and the chromium plated drum glazed them. Of course, they came off a bit curly, and sometimes they stuck, and you had to start again. But for the whole day, this machine would be running, and you'd have prints going round, so they'd come through from the darkroom, and then you had people who did the retouching, and all the photographs had to be retouched with spots and marks on them, and you would take out spots and marks and use pencils and ink, little pens to do the retouching. That was quite a skilled job. And then they had to be mounted, so you had a heated press, and you put a sheet of dissolved heat film underneath the picture onto your mount, and you put it under heat press, and it melted the gelatin stuff, and you stuck your picture down. So now you see pictures that were mounted probably 50 years ago, and they're still absolutely perfect. Today, you use double-sided sellotape, but after a bit it curls up. So we had a lot of people working for us then, and we had this big studio, and people brought their kids in to be photographed. They had family groups, and you did a lot of farmers' weddings, because father was a great talker and a great drinker, and he used to meet a lot of people in the pubs or at the races. You like going to the races, and they would say, "Oh, Geoffrey, when my daughter gets married, will you do the wedding?" And they always wanted a discount, because all farmers want a discount. They don't want anything full price. So when I took over the business in the 60s, I'd still got farmers who said, "Oh, I knew your father, Geoffrey. He was a great man. Oh, you always bought me a drink." And I said, "Well, I'm not buying you a drink. And would you do my daughter's?" "Yeah, we'll do your daughter's wedding, and that's the price." "Oh, what about a discount?" "No, you don't want to give you a discount. I'm trying to make money, not give it away." And you always had great fun with farmers. It taught you a lesson, really, how to deal with the general public. So
you took over the business in the 60s.
yep.
So could you paint that scene, because you were a young man,
Right.
you were a photographer.
Okay, I got married in 1959 and we bought a house for £1,500 in Y Terrace, which is the row of Victorian houses between the old bridge and the new bridge. Of course, the new bridge wasn't built then, the Greyfriars Bridge, and that was built in the 60s, and we had all the noise of that going on. But I had an A35 Austin van, which had been on honeymoon in down to Bournemouth. But anyway, I used to drive from the bottom of Bridge Street to King Street every morning and park the car. And there were no yellow lines, no traffic wardens, and no traffic virtually. The whole of King Street, you'd see about 3 or 4 cars. So you can't believe anybody would drive 200 yards to work. And then, but in those days, of course, 1960, I've got a gentleman's a book of 1953, I think, and it lists all the shops in King Street, and they were all individual shops. There were no telephone shops. There was an estate agent, Paul Barnsley, but you had opposite us was an outfitters called Richards, T.J. Richards, and above them was a dentist called Wilfred Strip. And he went into his dentist, and he had a chair that looked like it came from America in the days of the cowboys, a wooden thing with a leather, and a hand-driven drill, a foot-operated drill. So you used to pump this thing and drill, and that was really very basic. It sounds like Dickens almost. And then you had gardeners next door, been there for donkey's years, and you used to see all the rabbits hanging up with the little buckets under to collect the blood. And of course, in the season, the salmon there'd be dozens of salmon, no refrigeration or anything, covered in flies. Nobody died from it. It was perfectly all right. On the corner, you had Wilson's, the grocers, and we used to go there and have our grocery. A little lad called Michael delivered it every week, and I've still got the book from 1960s of the week's supplies. About £1, 10 shillings or so, 30 bob, probably for a week's groceries. And laundry, you didn't have washing machines in those days, so we had the sanitary laundry from Ledbury Road. We used to come and collect the washing each week and bring it back, put it on the doorstep. So in that sort of area, you had everything. There was newsagents on the corner, Wadden's sweet shop, of course, there, Mrs. Thomas's wool shop, had the spread eagle at the top if you wanted to drink. You got the orange tree the other way. Next to the orange tree was a chap called Harold Ladmore, and he had a radio and bicycle shop, and he was always a bit of a mechanic. If anything went wrong with any kit, we took it round to Harold Ladmore, and he would fix it. And people went in there to have their batteries charged. You had wet cell batteries, and they used to come in from the country with these glass batteries, and he had a whole workshop charging batteries. So people they had a radio, but you had to fire it with a wet battery. You didn't have dry batteries. So it was Harold Ledmore. And then we had a fish and chip shop, Alcox's fish and chip shop, and you had a bookies. Denny Isaacs, the bookie, was next to Russell Bull and Bright. So you had Mrs. Alcox, who always smelt of chip fat, and then you had Denny Isaacs. And in Denny Isaacs were father loved to gamble, and my grandmother did as well. But I used to go in there, and father said, go and put, half a crown on so-and-so. And in there were a whole motley crew of people, the sort of dregs of society. And there was no television or anything like that. You had bare floor. They were all smoking woodbines, and you heard the races through a squawk box up on the wall. There was a commentary on the races, and they'd all sit there and put their money on. And then my grandmother used to, when she had the first television set in King Street, used to invite some of these characters up to watch the Grand National or whatever, and you'd go up into a upstairs flat, and there was these, one of them was a one-legged jockey. He was a funny little chap. And real Damon Runyon characters almost, these people. They would sit in there and be smoking woodbines, and Grandma would give them a drink, but a glass of Guinness or something. And then over the road there was Clunes Yard. That was a stables there, and a chap called, one of the jockeys called Ernie, used to exercise the horses every day from Clunes Yard. Now, Edward Pritchard has got his house at the back there now, but that was a livery stables. And then who else was in the street? Well, at the top of the street, of course, we had the hotel. What the hell was it called? No, it wasn't. It was called, oh, I can't remember what the Residence. The Residence Hotel was on the corner of Victorian Gothic building, with a big yard behind it, which again was a sort of a stable yard and coaching yard for horses and coaches. And that was knocked down, and of course they built Thorpe House there. But the boys at that Residence Hotel, they both went to Cathedral. In fact, one of them's in the local, in our old Herefordshire magazine this week, Miles Quest. But then on the corner of Aubrey Street, we had a Perry's, was a petrol station, and the petrol pumps came out over the pavement. Now, you wouldn't have that today, but the pumps were inside the windows, Shell pumps, and you used to fuel them through a pipe, like a gantry came out over the pavement. And that behind them was Reg Brown, who sold Sunbeam cars. He was the Sunbeam agent, and the Hereford Times moved into that building a lot later, but you had Reg Brown. So you had all these different characters and all these private shops, and Bridge Street was all private shops, so a lot of it was houses, were boarding houses and things like that. Yeah, well, Donovan C. Wilson was one of Father's great opposition. He did a lot of weddings and very similar work. Then we had Bustins, of course, who were famous and did a lot of cattle photography. And I remember old man Bustin, and he used to go into the Spread Eagle, and Father used to go into the Spread Eagle, and the landlord that Spread, I think it was Frank Tadday in those days, he said to Father, well, I'd like some pictures of the pub, you know, would you do that, Father? So, well, yes. And old man Bustin was sitting there, and he said, well, I've been in practice for bloody years. He said, you didn't ask me. And Frank said, yes. He said, well, you come in here day after day, you drink half a pint of beer, take all day to do it. And he said, Jeff comes in and spends a lot of money, so I'm going to do him. It was a bit like that. They had some comic repartee between these two. But there were other photographers, somebody down St Martin Street as well. I can't remember the name. It was somebody like Wheeler and somebody, you know. But there were quite a few, but 3 or 4, not more than that. But then, of course, we got a lot of, all the estate agents came to us for photographs of there, and there were a lot of estate agents. And as I was saying to you earlier, I was looking at the figures from years back, and we did something like £50,000 worth of work a year just for estate agents. And we were very busy. I had a chap working for me, and we had a van with a name on the side, and we both had vehicles, and we were out virtually all day. But in those days, we were only taking black and white pictures, usually of the outside, and we didn't have any restrictions like the Property Misrepresentations Act, because if there was a Russell Borum, I remember old man Russell saying, I remember your father, oh, it was John Crofts, I think, said, Father all pleased us. He said, we took a picture of a house with a telegraph pole in front of it and got rid of the telegraph pole, which had to be all done by hand tinting, you know, hand to. And he said, we thought that was marvellous. Well, you're not allowed to do that now. If there's a pole in front and it's got to stay there, otherwise you're cheating them. And if you say a house has got a beautiful outlook to the south, you've got to say, well, it's got to the north as well. You can't just ball it up too much. So nowadays you're quite restricted on what you can do, although with Photoshop and digital photography you can change everything. You can turn the house around, alter the sky, put trees in, put out anything like. And after Bustin's finished, we took on a lot of work for the Hereford Herd Book Society, and that was quite time consuming. Father knew all the breeders all around Hereford and the 3 counties pretty well, and you used to go out and photograph bulls. It took ages to photograph a bull. They have to be standing exactly the right way. You've got to have the legs 4 square like a table, and the handler would have a long stick, and he would keep prodding the foot until the bull moved it, and he'd pick his foot up and put it down, and if it wasn't the right place, you tickled it again. So it took ages to get these photographs. And Hereford bulls are fairly dozy, and they don't get very excited, so you used to have usually somebody holding a dog or something like that up, and they'd take an interest in a dog, or like dogs. So you'd get them looking up, and once they looked up and they got their ears up and they were looking bright, their legs were in the right position, then you took a picture. And you didn't have a motorised camera or anything. You took a picture and you had to change the slide and put another one in. By then the bull had probably moved. So used to go to the Three Counties show and the Royal Welsh and all the big shows and photograph the prize winners and take pictures for the herd book. And of course, the herd book's virtually gone these days. It was a huge business, and they travelled all over the world. We didn't go with them, but they travelled all over the world exporting and listing cattle.
If we could speak about Derek, now could you use his name as well, please, Richard?
Yeah, yeah.
Gives,
And the studio generally.
and the studio.
Yeah.
So,
Ready to go.
ready to go.
Okay, Derek Evans, yes, Derek, of course, was in a different line of business. He was a photojournalist, a very good photojournalist, you know. And he also, of course, when the first television came out, he used to film things on a great big Bell and Howell or whatever it was, cine film, 16mm. And then they used to rush that down to the station to put it on the train for the to go to Birmingham or London. They didn't have anything like electronic transfer and so on. But Derek was always a real character, and he didn't really impinge on our work at all because he was photojournalism basically, and he took some wonderful photos. You know, you've seen his pictures. But we got to know Derek very well. And of course, he was in the Rotary Club when I joined it, and Derek and I used to go off to Scotland playing golf. And if you'd ever met Derek, you know, like me, he never stopped talking. So the two of us, we would drive 356 miles or whatever it is to St Andrews and never stop talking. The only time we ever stopped talking was when a wheel nut came off a lorry and hit the windscreen right in front of him, put a hole in it or virtually through it. And that stopped him talking for a while. So we had to have a new windscreen fitted when we got up to St Andrews. But he was full of stories, and he smoked, of course, Sweet Afton cigarettes. And I think I did smoke in those days. Everybody, well, when you're in the forces, at 10 o'clock when the NAFI van came round, you'd have a mug of tea and a packet of senior service. But he always smoked the Sweet Afton, these Irish cigarettes. And I remember sitting in St Andrews, we decided we wouldn't go to the Scores Hotel one year because it was so expensive. The Scores was where they filmed Chariots of Fire. They had a bar called the Chariots Bar. It was a bit expensive, so Derek said, we've got to find somewhere cheaper. We went to one of these tenement blocks in St Andrews, these big granite blocks of houses, and we were put in the attic room, which was obviously the maid's room in the old days, and it had a sloping ceiling. And the bathroom was, you had to bend down to get into the bathroom. It was right under the seating. But Derek sat in bed talking, smoking Sweet Afton, non-stop. And it had nylon sheets, I remember this bed. It was that time. He put his ashtray in between us. I for God's sake, move this ashtray out of the way. So he put it to one side. And in the morning when I woke up, he was still sitting in bed smoking and telling stories. I think he went to sleep at some time. But he said he used to tell the most outrageous. He was a bit of a lad, Derek. He one or two times he got very nearly caught, I think, doing something naughty. And he'd tell me about this. Well, I laughed. We used to laugh and laugh and laugh at his stories. And I think they got elaborated a little bit, you know. They sort of, but he was a great raconteur. And of course, he always had a habit of talking behind his hand. He said, you know, and when you're in Rotary Club and somebody was talking, he said, he's a complete plot. And he said, quiet, you know. But he had opinions about it. And of course, he was very politically minded. Liberals, I mean, anybody who wasn't a liberal was rubbish. We went on a golfing trip to the Algarve, and we're all about 20 of us sitting around a table, and he had a go at a bank manager. And he said, well, of course, he said, you're the scourge of you taking the money off the poor and robbing them. I said, for God's sake, what are you doing? And the bank manager goes, I'm not going to sit here and have this objectionable language going on. So he got up and walked out. And we said to him, you've upset him. Oh, well, he said, if you can't take a joke. So it wasn't a joke. He was very upset about your comment. But he used to say things like that to people and have no regard to the consequences whatsoever. He'd say, you know, oh, you do this. And he had very strong opinions about things, and he didn't really worry what he said to people. But he was very funny sometimes. He really had some wonderful times together, Derek and I. But we didn't really clash on photography at all. We were in different fields altogether. But you were talking about the 1960s, and was it, the the Carnaby Street era and all that thing. I can remember going to buy flared trousers and a white belt and a cardigan, and I thought it was really the dogs, you know. But everybody did that, and but a friend of mine, he went all the way to London to buy a complete outfit, and he came back, and his father, who worked on the railways and lived in Grandsend Road, and I can't use the word in front of that, he stood there and he said, "What do you think of this, Dan?" He said, "You look a complete..." So, oh, it's gone to a great deal of trouble to get the trendy kit. But and then of course you had the phases of wedding dresses and so on. When Princess Margaret got married, she had a big rose, I think, there. So after that, every bride had a big rose there. And as the fashionable people got married, it's a bit like when Princess Diana got married. You suddenly, everybody wants a dress like hers. So you could tell the eras pretty well by the dresses and what people wore. And those days, everybody went to a wedding. You wore your Sunday best. Now you go to a wedding, people are in rugby shirts and jeans, and it's all a bit too casual, really. I haven't got a 5x4 camera anymore. We sold, or we used to have we used to have a Kodak Specialist camera, which took pictures, glass plates, and then sheet film, and it was very heavy. It was a big camera. It was actually basically wood, but it had a metal frame, and of course it had rise and fall on it. So you corrected your verticals by using rise and fall. You could tilt the front lens and back, and you had interchangeable lenses. You had wide angle, portrait lenses, and so on. And now, of course, you do it all on Photoshop. You put in Photoshop 5 or whatever, and you can correct your verticals. But in those days, you had to do it manually, and you had to focus the camera with a black hood over your head, a black sheet. So even at weddings, I was there underneath a black sheet focusing, and then you had to work out the exposure, and you did that with a Western Master exposure meter, which you took a light reading and used to point that round and show different, and then you'd work out the speed of the film and the amount of light and give it an exposure, and you'd expose for 15th of a second or 20th or 30th. I mean, a lot of the film was so slow that you had to give it sort of 10th of a second exposure. Now it's like 1,000th of a second, and you'd take perhaps 1 or 2 shots. You didn't take 12 or 13 and pick the best on the computer. You had to get it right pretty well with 1 shot, and then you'd go back and process it all, and you could correct under and overexposure a little bit when you were printing. But those were sort of what we call field cameras, and then eventually you got copies of this is Father's Leica camera, one of the cameras he had. One of them is lying underneath the rowing club at Worcester, actually. He was photographing Worcester Regatta, and it fell out of its leather case into the water, never to be seen again. A lot of the boys from the rowing club all dived down to try and fetch this out, but they couldn't find it. But that was an old Leica, and of course that was made before the war, 1930s Leica, and then after the war, the Japanese started copying them, and you had things like this Pentax, which is a pentaprism camera with interchangeable lens. That became very cheap. But in the days when that came out, it was, to buy one of those was probably 2 or 3 months' salary. You know, they were probably £200. In those days, people were getting paid 15 quid a week. So, but nowadays, you can work for about 2 hours and buy a camera. In those days, you'd work for 2 or 3. So it had those for doing that. That was my first. Everybody had a little first camera, a little box brownie, something like that, which was a step up from the old box brownies. And eventually, we went on to Hasselblads, which is these with interchangeable lenses. That's a portrait lens on there, and interchangeable magazines, so you could shoot colour and black and white and transparency all on the same camera just by changing magazines. But again, they weren't auto exposure and they weren't auto focus. You had to focus them and you had to get the exposure right. So you'd take, a few rolls of film, but rolls of colour film would be about £3 or £4 each. This is back in the sort of 60s, so you didn't use too many rolls, and you'd go out on a job and perhaps shoot 5 or 6 rolls of films. You had to come back and then process them and then print them. So it moved on until everybody now has a little digital camera like that, and it's auto exposure, auto focus, auto everything. It literally is point and shoot. And those have gone out of fashion because everybody uses their phones nowadays. But originally, of course, phones didn't take very good quality pictures. Now they're up to 10 or 12 or whatever million megapixels and so on. And
So can anyone be a photographer?
anybody can be a photographer. Everybody is a photographer. And that's really the bane of my life, because when video first came out, people bought video cameras, and you'd go to weddings, and as people got more expensive cameras, better cameras, we would take a lot of trouble to arrange the groups. And you usually had an assistant with you who arranged the bride's dress, and we had little weights to put down in case it was windy. And you'd carefully arrange the dress, and you'd get them to hold the flowers in the right place, because they'd hold them here or there, and hold the flowers. And we made sure that the bride and groom were on the right side. The bride used to be on the left of the groom, so that you're supposed to keep your right hand for your sword to protect your bride. So, and when they came out of church, said you're on the wrong side, change over. People didn't know the etiquette that well, and of course, then later on, you had a lot of families that were split up. You had people who you'd got divorced. I mean, we didn't have many divorces in those days. So suddenly you had a mother and a new partner, and you had to worry, were they allowed on the picture? We don't want bloody her in the picture. God, you know, don't let her. So you had to take another group, another family group. But the etiquette was fairly fixed. You always took the bride and groom and the bride's family. But nowadays, families are all mixed up, and you don't know who the hell some people are. There's too many of them.
I think what I'm trying to get at is that, so we can all take a photograph,
Yep.
but does that make us a photographer? So you have to employ so
No.
many skills. So what
Yeah. No, I don't think so. But yes, as you say, everybody can take a photograph, and today's photographs, I mean, compared with the 1950s and 60s, it's wonderful, wonderful colour, wonderfully sharp. You can't go wrong. But in the old sense of a photographer, you used to train for quite a few years at college or whatever, and then do basically an apprenticeship. Start by doing the developing, and that can go wrong. You know, you could forget to agitate the films, or put the light on and fog them all, so you had mistakes like that. But Father started out with in a partnership with somebody who was an ex-RAF photographer of the wartime. But that went sour, and his only advice to me when I took over the business, he says, never take a partner. Employ somebody or be employed, but he said, partnerships nearly always go wrong. And I think it was quite true that it got to the stage where this other chap was sabotaging work, you know, and it got really rather nasty. So Father said, you know, work on your own or pay somebody, but don't take a partnership with anybody. Well, this is the sort of thing that George Eastman Kodak originally developed when he invented flexible film, and he brought out the Kodak #1. That's just a typical box camera, and you put a roll of film in there, and it had a shutter that was fixed at one speed, about a 25th of a second, and it took a picture that was a bit fuzzy, but that's what most people had in their families. And the old albums had little sepia tone pictures of picnics and days at the seaside. And then it gradually became, later, this is sort of camera I had as a first camera. This is still called a Brownie 127. That took roll film, and it still had a one-speed shutter, no autofocus, but it was a little bit more advanced than the other one. And then, of course, the Germans developed the Leica camera before the war, and that was really a big advance, had a focal plane shutter, but again, it didn't have autofocus, it didn't have auto exposure. You had to work with an exposure meter to gauge the light levels, and you'd go around a room and take different readings and take them. And then the Japanese copied the Leica and came out with one of the first pentaprism cameras, the Pentax S1A, and that was a revolution. Interchangeable lenses, took 35mm film in the days when colour was coming on as well, so you could shoot colour, black and white, whatever. But that was very expensive. In the 60s, that would be, you know, quite a few months' wages to buy one of those. And nowadays, you can buy a camera for working for about 2 hours. And we went on from Rolleiflexes, twin lens reflex, to the Hasselblads, which have got interchangeable lenses. That's a portrait, sort of a long lens for portraits. And it's got interchangeable mags, so you'd have a magazine with black and white film in, a magazine with colour film, and a magazine with transparency. But they were all fairly slow films. The transparency film was only about 100 ASA, which is today is very, very slow. And Derek told me when he started shooting Kodachrome, you had to use something like a 25th of a second. Well, to get people to stay still for that long. In the old days, of course, in the studio, people had neck rests and so on, so you couldn't move for 25 or 30 seconds. But that was the workhorse of nearly every general practice photographer for years. You could do anything with that, almost portraits, weddings, commercial work. What you couldn't do was correct the verticals and so on. But this, they also made a very wide angle camera called the Super Wide C, which was so wide that you really didn't have converging verticals and so on. You could point at the building. You didn't have to tilt it up or down. So that went on until everybody bought these little cameras, which are point and shoot, autofocus, auto exposure. You don't have to guess anything at all. And you can take dozens of pictures on a card. And of course, those are now replaced by camera phones, which have got the same quality as these original little digital cameras. So as I say, when we photographed weddings originally, you were the professional and you wore a decent suit and they all wore decent clothes. And when you asked people to do things, they did it. And you said, oh, Mr. Hammond, yes, where would you like us to stand? And so now you go to a wedding and say, oh, God, are you going to be, oh, why are you taking this? Why? And they, they've got no interest in it at all. But in those days, because you were paying them a fair amount of money to do the job, they'd do as you asked. But then people got their own cameras and suddenly you found that we'd arranged a beautiful group. And over your shoulder with cameras coming like this and video cameras and when the big ones like that. And people were shooting the thing that you'd trained years to do and take, and they were doing it themselves. So you didn't sell reprint. We made our money quite often by, we gave them a set of proofs which had rough proof printed right across them so they couldn't use them. Although you used to go into houses sometimes, you see a framed picture with rough proof by Hammond's Photography stamped across it. They never bought a proper print. But the idea was you gave a set of proofs and then they'd, oh, we'll have one of number 3 and number 3. We want one for Granny, one for Uncle and so on. That's all gone because nowadays you've got it on your computer and you just email it to somebody. Here's the wedding pictures or the pictures of the baby. So that's why the demise of the general practice photographer came about, because everybody suddenly became photographers. And then, like a lot of professions, the people who take it up as amateurs think they know more about it than the professionals. So you know, they tell you what. And you used to get people to say, oh, what's that camera using? Oh, I've got one of those. And, Christ, and they'd have cameras better than I had sometimes. You know, oh, we bought this kit. But of course, people, like when Dixon started up, they used to sell 35mm camera kits to people, and you used to buy a telephoto lens, a wide-angle lens, a standard lens, and something else. So you'd see people going around carrying about half a hundredweight of lenses and cameras. But now you've got cameras with built-in zoom, so you don't need separate lenses at all. Yep.
I wonder if you can describe, and can you say Mayfair in your
Yeah, well, working in King Street every year we had the Mayfair, and it went right down Bridge Street and all the way through Broad Street, through Hightown, down Commercial Road, and outside the Baptist Church. There was always complaints because they had a striptease show usually outside there, and the Baptist Church didn't like that very much. But I can remember all these different stalls, and there was all a freak show as well. And outside Wathans, there was a woman sitting on the floor in a tent, and you paid 6pence to go in, and she didn't have any. She only had hands on her shoulders like a thalidomide. So I don't know what caused it, but a pleasant-looking woman. She sat there and did everything with her feet, painting and knitting and everything, and she just had and people used to pay 6pence to go in and watch this poor soul do that. And you thought nothing of it in those days. Of course, they had boxing booths as well. Yeah, so yeah, one of the attractions for the local farm lads and so on, and the labourers used to come in, was the boxing booths. really rough-looking blokes there. I mean, you wouldn't want to pick a fight with any of them. But if you could stand up for 30 seconds or whatever it is, you won something. But a lot of the booths were shies and freak shows. And I think I told you once we were talking about they had a lot of con artists there as well. And there was one, you went in and you paid £6, and then it said, this way to the water otter. And when you got there, it was a kettle. And then the other one was signed for the exit, but it was one of the Latin words, you see. People would spend too long in these shows. They want to get them through. So and this way to so-and-so, and they get out and they find they're out in the street. So they worked all sorts of things, and there were all sorts of people doing 3-card tricks and this sort of thing. But it was absolutely packed with people, and the whole of Hereford, they came in from all over the place to the fair. It was a really big thing. But as I say, some of the stuff, it wouldn't be tolerated these days. You wouldn't have freak shows, and you wouldn't have some of the con artists. They were really people sort of duping. And there was a chap called Gypsy Lee. He had a little office round in Palace Yard, and he used to sell herbal medicines. And he used to go have a stall down at the market as well. But you had those people like that, sort of snake oil salesmen. And they always reckoned that Gypsy Lee, he had round pills, white ones, and he reckoned that it was rabbit droppings wrapped in flour. For selling these as a cure-all. But the people used to, I mean, the most outrageous claims for the thing. I mean, even proper chemists, they used to sell things like Dr. Clark's blood tonic and so on. What the hell was in that? I don't know. But people used to, oh, this is what you want to do. And of course, father's doctor was, what's his name? Francis, Dr. Francis, Cyril Francis round by Castle Street. And the chap who used to drive around in a horse and trap, well known, only wore striped trousers and a black jacket. And he was father's doctor, and father got on ever so well with him because he used to go to see him, and Cyril would say to Geoffrey, said, I think what you need is a dozen oysters and a good bottle of port. And that was, he said, I've just had a barrel of oysters in from Whitstable. You know, I would recommend those. He had one of the finest wine cellars, so we're told, in Hereford. But he was father's sort of doctor because, you know, anybody who prescribed oysters and port or whiskies, a tot of whiskey at night, do your world of good. And he probably did too, you know. I mean, as good as most of the nostrums that the snake oil people were selling.
I'm just wondering, some of in Derek's collections, photographs of boys jumping off the Victoria Bridge into the River Wye and swimming. Did you ever do anything like that?
No, I wasn't daft enough, I don't think. But yes, they did, and they jumped off the Wye Bridge as well. But I mean, in early days, there was Jordan's Boatyard opposite the Rowing Club, and we used to have charabancs coming up from the valleys, and the Welsh miners came in charabancs, and they always wore their best Sunday best, and they all had white silk scarves. As, you know, filthy job working down the colliery, and they used to come up on a Sunday, and they used to hire the boats from Jordan's. And why most of them weren't drowned, I don't know, because they couldn't row, they couldn't swim, most of them, and you'd see these boats lurching about all over. And of course there was, I don't know, they had drinking in Hereford. Yes, they would have done on Sunday, but of course in Wales it was dry on a Sunday, so they'd come over the border, A, to get a drink, and B, to have a day out. And so they had a wonderful time, and there was all sorts of shouting and drinking going on. And the Rowing Club in those days, in the 50s and so on, had a lot of boats, and you had to book them weeks in advance if you wanted to take a boat out. So most of the people took boats out on a Sunday, and I did when I was first married. My wife and I rented, well, I was a member of the Rowing Club, so you'd book a boat. And we had a cat that came in the front of the boat, and we went up to Belmont Woods, and you'd take some steak or something and have a barbecue and come back. But they all rowed up to the camping. There's a picture of me at the camping in your book. And they'd row as far as that. And when we lived at Brainton, father and mother and my brother and I used to walk down to the riverbank to the V stream was outside the camping, and then the boys from the Rowing Club would arrive there, and they'd ferry us across, and you'd walk up all this great big flight of steps to the camping, and then they have a fire on the side of on the bank there, and cook a meal. And then they used to also have an annual outing from Hay or Glazebury down to Hereford, and it was the captain's outing. And basically that was a floating booze up. Their boat was loaded with crates of Cheltenham light ale. And the main thing was not to sink the boat with too much booze. So you'd have crates, literally crates and bottles of beer going up. By the time they came back, they were all pretty well smashed, but you weren't driving in those days. People did. And then, of course, people got cars and so on. She went out for and Jordan's boathouse disappeared. Nobody rose from the rowing club.
Wondered, because there's lots of photographs in Deb's collection
Yep.
of you. The Hammond's family having these wonderful lazy days on the river. But was you're a child growing up in Herefordshire. Was there something uniquely Hereford-like in your upbringing? There's something unique about a childhood in Herefordshire?
I don't think. I think the uniqueness of it was the wartime. Really, I mean that was a leveller. When we lived at Brainton, it was wartime, and I say you didn't have milk delivered. You walked to the dairy with the cans and got your milk. Bread was delivered probably once a week from Burton's Bakery. You didn't have a fridge. The milk was kept cool with a clay pot over it in a bucket of water. We didn't have a bathroom at Brainton. I used to take a jug of hot water up to father to shave each morning, and we had an outside lavatory, which was a bit of a trip at night on a winter's night with a bucket. And one of my brother's jobs was to bury the bucket of each week. You'd dig a hole in the garden, empty the bucket, and then put Jay's powder in it. And we had, you didn't have toilet paper. Well, you might have had Isles, perhaps if you were lucky, but usually it was the Radio Times cut into squares hanging on a piece of string in the shed. Now, by the time my daughter's like, well, it sounds like you were living in Romania in the 1900s. I said, no, you didn't have things like soft toilet paper and so on. And you had a radio. We did have electricity, and you had a pilot radio up on a shelf, and that was your sole sort of media attention. We did have a paper. I think we had the Daily Express most days at a penny a throw, but you listened to the radio, and of course everybody had to sit quietly, turn the radio on. It took about 5 minutes to warm up, a valve radio, and you'd listen to the news, and then you'd listen to Workers' Playtime and Arthur Askey and all those sort of programmes. And that was your only entertainment other than going to the cinema. We had the Ritz Cinema and the Odeon Cinema, and we got into town by Yeoman's bus, and the Yeoman's buses had wooden slatted seats because there was no upholstery in wartime, and you sat on wooden slatted seats, and these big old double-deckers used to go, well, Wednesday was market day, and Saturday they'd go on Wednesday and Saturday, and the cattle were still driven into town for the market as well. You'd have cattle and so on coming down Kingsacre Road, but we also had a pony and trap, and this pony and trap, we had a pony called Greybird, which was a Welsh cross Arab, and it was a bit flighty, this one. My brother used to ride it, take it to gymkhanas, but father harnessed this into the trap, and it would go all right. You'd trot gently into town back, but if a yeoman's bus came towards it, it would bolt. And we have great vivid recollections of father and mother and my brother and I hanging on for grim death as this horse bolted up Kingsacre Road, and any chance you could be in the ditch or hit a tree or anything. We never came to any great harm, but the horse had gradually slowed down, our pony. And then after the war, I remember we had mother was a Methodist and very keen to help people, and they brought a lot of ex-POWs, and they asked people, could you look after them for a day or so to try and bring them back to normality? And we had a soldier who'd been in a POW camp for years, and we took him into town in the pony and trap, and this chap didn't say anything at all. He was pretty well traumatised, I think. And we sort of offered him food, and he could only eat a little bit because their stomachs had been, and he said they used to eat flies and things like that, and the rats. And of course we had a lot of Americans in Hereford, where we lived in Tower Road after we moved in from Brainton. There were GIs in Langford House, and we used to have a lot of Canadian RAF people who were at Garnons. Garnons was a RAF, a Canadian Air Force hospital and recuperation centre, and there's a huge American base at Leominster, of course, at Barons Cross. There were hundreds, thousands of Americans there. It was a big military hospital. But I can remember in Hereford, you'd see the Canadians, they had pale blue, like pyjama suits, pale blue, and you'd see these chaps walking around.
You weren't particularly a jazz fan, so
Well,
did you ever
no.
go to the
Yes, well,
records and what was it like being a teenager?
Well, teenager in Hereford, the social life in Hereford, we didn't have nightclubs or anything like that. We had Mrs. Turner's Dance Academy in Friar Street. And so for certain at 16 or 17, you'd go to Mrs. Turner's for the dancing, and that's where you met girls. And we also joined the Operatic Society, and I joined when I was about 16 or 17, and there were a lot of girls in the Operatic Society as well. So you had that sort of social life, and you also had quite a lot of functions like hunt balls and so on, which we'd go and photograph more than take part in, but everybody was dressed up in white ties and full dinner jackets. So a lot of big functions like that, and all the estate agents would have a dinner, and the old Herefordians have so dinners and things. But teenage years, really, we only had one coffee shop, the Continental, by All Saints Church, and they used to gather there and drink coffee, and then you'd go to dance classes and meet people. And village halls all had hops and little barn dances and so on. It's the builders that still knocking hell out. So that was it. And talking about music, well, you've got crazes like square dancing. When Prince Philip and Elizabeth went over to Canada, they put on check shirts and so on, and taught they would do. Everybody had to do square dancing there. All the dance schools gave lessons in square dancing. We used to do that. But when I went to the Air Force, jazz, I used to like traditional jazz, and it was in the days of Skiffle and Lonnie Donegan and so on. And in your hut of 20 odd people, somebody had a tea chest double bass, and somebody could perhaps play a mouth organ or whatever, and we used to have impromptu jazz sessions like that, or you'd go to clubs. And of course, in those days you had records of LPs and 45s and so on, so there's quite a bit of music, and the radio as well, from Radio Luxembourg, people like that, pop stuff. So that was the music scene, really.
So just wondered whether what you think about us recording your memories.
I think it's great. I wish, really, I did buy, well, Heather bought me a little sound recorder thing, a little dictaphone, because I was going to I thought, well, rather than writing things down, I'll dictate it. I dictated about 10 minutes, I think, and then put it on one side, and that was years ago, never used it since. But I think family law, the Hereford law, is wonderful, and I look through there and I know so many of the people and so many things they're talking about, and I just hope that, I wish that I knew how my grandmother came to Hereford. She was born near Plymouth, and her father was a miller, and how she got from there in the 1800s to Hereford, I don't know. Somebody thought she came up to Stroud to work in millinery, but whether that's so. How she met my grandfather, I don't know. I've got quite a bit of information about grandfather and his activities, because he was a well-known person in Hereford. And of course, my father, because I worked with him for many years. But back from there, now Deborah has been doing a family history, and she's come up with some very interesting. And it's surprising how you find out the skeletons in the cupboard. I mean, she said, "Do you remember a bloke called Fred Badimer?" Yes, he was gassed in the First World War. He had very heavy breathing, but he used to come and stay with him, and he was known as Cousin Fred. And people don't have any hard copies of things. Now, if you can do a book like you've done, or have a set of photographs, it's something real and tangible that people put on, rather than just folklore, But to actually speak to people who've been there and done that, and when they pass on at the age of 93 or whatever, you think, oh, crikey, I wish I'd known what it was like to be 10 years old when they were 10 years old, and recording all these things and it'll jog other people's memories as well. I think it's invaluable. I wish, you know, more people did it. But there's, of course, computers have brought that in, haven't they? Family trees and so on. People are going crackers doing their ancestry, but then sometimes it costs a lot of money.